Um, what is the good news? So there is some silver lining, actually, when it comes to government debt. And then how do you fix it? How do you make government debt, how do you make it better? How do you make it more manageable? How do you make it go down and pay it off, et cetera? So let's start off. What's the problem? Well, government debt's really high, right? So this is a chart of just all federal debt, all government issued debt. And you can see it's a line up and to the right. And we're currently at about $34 trillion in debt. And that number is expected to continue, right? As we have to finance new programs and current programs, that number has risen throughout all of history and it's going to continue to rise. But this has to be put into the context also of how large the economy is, right? So a certain amount of debt can be a lot for somebody on a single income. So say, for example, if you make $100,000 a year and you have $100,000 in debt, that is going to have an impact on you. But if you make $1 million a year and you have $200,000 of debt, you doubled your debt, but you increased your income multiple times. So it would make it more manageable. So to put it into the context of how much potential income the government has, we would divide this by GDP. And this is a more common figure that you'll see over time, right? Is the amount of government debt held by the public, in this case, as opposed to held within the government itself, as a percent of GDP. So you can see today we're at about 100% of GDP is in debt. And that's expected to continue to grow over time, right? Interestingly, I don't think most people would know this, but we've been in this place before, actually, around World War II. Wars are very expensive and require a lot of financing. And so the government spent a lot of money as part of the war effort. And we actually got to about 100% debt to GDP back in the 1940s. And since then, the economy started growing a lot. There's a lot of help by the baby boomers who came into working age. It's a very, very large cohort of people started paying taxes and really helped to drive that debt load down and make it more manageable. So we're going to talk about this government debt and what kind of makes it, how it goes higher, what are the risks of it, and then how maybe we can bring it down over time. A big part of the government debt that we want to be careful of is the actual interest costs, right? Because that's what the government has to pay every single year is the interest. It doesn't have to pay off that debt in a single year. In fact, it can continue to roll that debt over perpetually, right? You can just refinance your current debt with new debt, and you can do that basically for as long as you want. But if your interest costs start getting too high, well, then you start having a problem. And as you can see, for much of the 2010s, our government interest burden was not that bad. It was around 1.5% of GDP, which was similar to the 50s, 60s, and 70s. It ballooned to about 3% in the 80s, and that was part of when we had a lot of inflation and very high interest rates. But it came back down. And so even though our overall debt has increased enormously, the actual debt burden intra-year, the interest burden was pretty small and pretty manageable. But that's changed obviously quite a bit the last couple of years as interest rates have gone from basically, 0, 1, 2, 3% to more like 4, 5, 6%. And so as the government rolls off their old debt, they have to buy new debt or issue new debt. And that's at that higher interest rate. And that's why this interest cost is rising quickly. So this is obviously a concern. It's not the worst it's ever been, but it's getting close. So why is it growing? How do we go in debt? And it's pretty simple. It's just spending more than we make, right? So the government gets revenue just by taxing people, pretty simply. That's like 95% of the way the government makes money is by taxing people, corporations, et cetera. And then once it has all that money, it has to decide how to spend it. And if it spends more than it makes, then you go into what's called a federal budget deficit, right? And whenever it does go into a deficit and it spends more than it makes, it has to make up the gap by issuing debt, right? So for every year that we spend a little bit more than we make, we issue a little bit more debt. And so that's how that starts to increase. And where you'll see that typically is in a chart of the federal deficit. So you can basically think of this zero line every year, meaning if we collect, $1 trillion in taxes and we spend $1 trillion on various programs, then we have a balanced budget, right? We're spending exactly what we make. Typically, though, as you can see, we spend more than that. That's why it's under the zero line, right? That means we're spending more than we make. In the 1940s, like I said, there was an enormous spike downwards as we spent way more than we made to finance the war. But generally, we are in a deficit. We briefly went into a surplus. That's when we actually make a little bit more than we spend during the end of the Clinton administration. But that quickly went away and we went back to spending more than what we collect in taxes, right? And you can see what really exacerbates that is recessions, right? So you can kind of see a similar pattern. The gray bars are recessions. Anytime we hit a gray bar, you see that deficit come down, or the deficit goes up, but the amount of spending goes way up relative to what we make. So this is 2008. Obviously, that blew the deficit out. We spent a lot of money trying to stabilize the economy. And then, of course, more recently, COVID. There's an enormous stimulus package that you guys are all aware of. And that blew the deficit out pretty severely. As those stimulus packages went away, the deficit got better, right? So this does come back in, but it's still pretty high relative to history, right? So about 5% of GDP is overspending what we make. So that's how we get new debt. And those debts accumulate, right? So it's like every year we have a little bit of a budget deficit, but over many, many, many years, you end up getting a very large debt load like we have today. So what are the risks? So the number one risk, let's just think, is default, right? But I'm going to just come out and say default is extremely unlikely. So a default is when you owe money or you owe an interest payment to somebody that you borrowed money from, and you can't make a payment to them, right? And so you default. The reason that it's very unlikely is, unlike, for us, we can't go and print money. If you come to me and you say, hey, I need my $1,000 back, and I'm like, well, I don't have it, but here, let me go print it for you, that's fine. That'd be great, right? I can't do that, so I would default. The government, on the other hand, can just print money, right? Of course, this leads into issues, which we'll get to, but on a technical level, it is very difficult for the government to default. The only way that we really can default, and this has become an issue lately, is if basically the government chooses to. So whenever we run into the debt ceiling debates, and because we're debating on whether we want to raise the debt ceiling or not, there is a discussion over shutting down the government. Well, shutting down the government means that the government basically can't pay those past obligations. And if it doesn't pay those obligations, that would be a default. So there is a situation where we could default, but it would basically be self-inflicted, of our own choosing, where we say we have the money to pay you back, but because we're debating about something and we've decided to shut down the government, we cannot make that obligation, right? There's various workarounds that I don't want to spend too much time on, but people have toyed with the idea of minting a platinum coin, which, in the way it is written, I forget where it was called. I had it pulled up a second ago, but the Treasury Secretary essentially has the authority to mint a platinum coin of any denomination. So as there has been this idea of minting a $1 trillion coin, to where if we ever can't pay our debts, we can just create a coin that's worth an enormous amount of money and pay it down that way. Obviously, it was not the intended purpose of that written rule, but it appears to be legally feasible. But who knows what that would do? It's not a very serious solution that is talked about, but it is something that's been brought up to government officials and Fed officials before. On the other hand, in the 14th Amendment, there is a line that says the validity of the public debt of the United States shall not be questioned. And there's this idea that maybe because of this amendment, it's basically unconstitutional to default on our debt. And there's been a debate where, let's say President Biden, or any president, but Biden because he's the one currently in office, if Congress decides to shut down the government, if Biden could usurp that and basically say, no, we're paying off the debt and I have the authority based on this 14th Amendment. That's a debate that has happened before. He's actually expressly stated that he thinks he has the authority to do that, but no one's ever done it before. It's kind of uncharted territory. And if you were to do something like that, it would definitely be challenged in courts and probably cause a bit of turmoil. But moreover, a default's not very likely. What is a possible risk is hyperinflation, or just inflation in general, inflation that we don't want, right? And so the government can print money to pay its obligations, but let's just start saying it does that too much, to the point to where the rest of the world just doesn't value our currency anymore. They're just like, hey, if you're just going to keep printing more and more money, what good is your money? And that has happened in the past. On the left, this is a picture of a wheelbarrow filled with Zimbabwe dollars. And you can see there's just tons and tons and tons and tons of cash piled on top of it. But it's all essentially worthless, to the point to where they literally had $1 trillion notes to pay for things, okay? So that's extreme hyperinflation where the value of your currency means nothing. On the right, this is the German mark back after World War I. So this is the famous example of the Weimar Republic, which experienced hyperinflation after, Germany financed much of World War I with debt. After they lost the war, they were forced to pay reparations back to the countries that won. And in order to do this, they had to print a lot of their own currency. But more and more as they did that, nobody wanted their currency, and it became extremely worthless, to the point to where in 1918, roughly one German mark would be the equivalent of one gold mark. And then just 6 years later, it would take 1 trillion paper marks to buy that same piece of gold, right? And I got some kind of fun examples here. A loaf of bread in Berlin cost about 160 marks at the end of 1922. And it cost 200 billion marks by late 1923. So that's true hyperinflation, where it just spirals and your currency becomes completely worthless. By November 1923, a $1 was worth 4.2 trillion German marks. So that's how worthless the currency was, okay? Those are very extreme examples, and they are caused by the rest of the world losing faith and just not wanting any part of your currency because there's nothing backing it, right? Currently, and I'm going to show this in some different ways in a second, there is quite a bit of faith and demand for dollars, right? So on the left here, I have global foreign reserves, out ex-US. So this is every country except for the US, how much they hold in their reserves. 58% of that is in US dollars. So if you could think of a situation where the US dollar were to default and become worthless, well, it's not just going to hurt us. 58% of other countries' reserves are in our currency, right? So it would wipe away half of their reserves. So there's kind of this mutual incentive where, at least currently, we don't want that, or there's nothing that's replaced the US dollar to be able to take that position. On the right, we have another way of showing that, which is global transactions by currency, right? So the US dollar today is the global reserve currency. Basically, that just means that a lot of transactions that happen internationally happen in dollars, okay? So much so, about 90, I guess what would this be, 89, 88% of global transactions are made with the US dollar. And the second place is the euro, right? But it's really not even close. After that, it's just Japanese yen, the British pound, and then the Chinese yuan. What I would be concerned about if I were to say, what does the rest of the world losing faith in the dollar look like? It would be these light blue bars going down, right? So until we see that, I don't think we've kind of hit that debt spiral yet, but that would certainly be what you would want to look for, is the rest of the world losing faith in the strength of our dollar. Okay, so what is some of the good news? Well, first off, right now, the dollar is strong. So this is called the Dixie Index. It's basically the dollar relative to a basket of other currencies. And you can see since 2007, it's basically gone straight up. And this is while we've been issuing all this debt, right? So the rest of the world, basically what this is saying is the rest of the world hasn't quite reached a point to where they think our dollar is worthless, or we're not able to pay our debts or something like that. Another way to look at that is just to look at every other currency in the world relative to our dollar. So this is a list of every currency in the world and how it has appreciated or depreciated to the dollar in the last 10 years. And you can see every single currency except for the Armenian dram and the Swiss franc have depreciated relative to the dollar. meaning the dollar over the last 10 years at least is in a very, very strong place to the rest of the world. And so, why might that be? One of the main reasons is the US's greatest asset is the US consumer. US consumers spend an extraordinary amount of money, and they don't just spend it on stuff made in the US, they spend it on stuff made all over the world, right? So there's a lot of demand for our US dollars because other countries want to attract our customers. But setting that aside for now, let's just look at how we compare with the rest of the world in terms of our debt load. So if we only look at government debt, that's going to be this table here on the left. We're 11th in the world in terms of our debt to GDP, right? So we have 129% of all total federal government debt to GDP, and that's 11th place. The highest is Japan. They have 260% debt to GDP. And I did want to put, just for contrast, what does it mean to be the least indebted countries in the world? And that would be these, right? So like Brunei, for example, has only 2% debt to GDP. But one thing I kind of want to point out is that these countries here aren't necessarily the glowing example of what a flourishing developed economy looks like, right? I think we could all agree. Versus on the left, you're seeing more developed economies. And I show this because I kind of want to make one point that although debt is bad and it's an obligation that we have to pay back in the future at some point, the spending that you get out of that is good, right? So there's kind of a debt and asset side to that equation. Spending is stimulative. It gives people resources. It allows you to build new things, build infrastructure, put money directly in people's pockets, et cetera. And so there is kind of this positive side initially, but of course, like all debt, eventually you have to pay that back, right? So there's this constant balance between how much benefit you're getting from issuing new debt versus what the actual burden is on future citizens, future generations. One thing I want to talk about too is this chart on the right. So it's similar to the one on the left, but I've added a couple things. So I added local, so state and local debt. So on the left, when I talk about government debt to GDP, what I'm really talking about is when the federal government issues treasury bonds, right? But state governments, local governments, and corporations and people also go into debt, right? And so if we add those to the government debt, we get kind of the overall indebtedness of the country. And that's what this chart on the right is. So you can see Japan is still number one. They have 415% debt to GDP. And then you see France, Canada, China is an enormous one. I kind of highlight China here because there are discussions, I would suppose, that if anyone were to ever overtake the US as the reserve country of the currency of the world, or kind of the dominant power, it would be China, which somewhat makes sense. They have an enormous country in terms of landmass and resources, an enormous population. But look, they're not without their faults as well. They issue a lot of debt, especially at the local level. And you're seeing some of those issues now. China's in a pretty nasty property recession. They build a lot of property. Sometimes it doesn't get filled up and it doesn't pay off anything. And so they end up having to default on a lot of those properties. So other countries have issues too, maybe not at the federal level quite to the same degree as we do, but certainly at the local and individual level. And the US is here right after South Korea, right? And then we see Spain, Italy, the UK, and Germany. So although our debt is very high, we are in the ballpark of other countries, which doesn't mean it necessarily makes it okay, but it means if the rest of the world were to lose faith in the dollar, they would have to choose something else. And the other countries, other major developed countries, haven't exactly proved themselves as more responsible when it comes to debt. The other side of the equation that no one talks about is the asset side, right? So you think of yourself, your personal net worth. Some of you may have debt, right? And if you just went around and only told people how much debt you have, maybe people would be like, oh, I don't know about that, But there has to be context with the amount of assets that you have as well, right? A house is a great example. If you own a $500,000 house and you have a $300,000 mortgage, well, that's a positive net worth, right? You don't just say I have $300,000 of debt and a mortgage. You have to say it in the context of your home as well. There are large studies. I've kind of put the URL of one at the top, but there is a nice summary of it by UBS and Credit Suisse, who attempted to sort of calculate the assets within a country relative to its debt level. And this includes several things. It includes, let me see, real estate prices, equity market prices, exchange rates, human resources, natural resources, capital and technological advancements, the military, things like that, right? And so when you try to quantify all those things and put them together, their estimate is that we have $139 trillion worth of assets to that $34 trillion of debt, or a 5.5% or 5.5 ratio, meaning we have 5 times as many assets as we do debt. And that would be the highest. If we kind of went down from there, you would see Europe at $104 trillion of assets, and then China. But the important part is looking at this wealth to GDP ratio here, where, you know, our debt to GDP is 100%, right? But our wealth to GDP is 500%, right? So we do have an enormous amount of assets, and they're important because, look, these are things that could potentially be taxed, right? So if we ever decided that we really wanted to make a big effort to go and pay down the debt, we could go tax more stuff. And we know there's talks about this, right? There's wealth taxes, there's unrealized gains taxes, and stuff that's incredibly unpopular. And I certainly don't know if it's a good idea. I don't know, it doesn't sound great, but it is potential revenue, right? That's sitting out there, and that's important to put into context when it comes to the rest of the debt. And this real quick, I'll kind of gloss over this, but this is, you know, the citizens are the ones that are paying the taxes, right? That are fueling the revenue for the government. And so the actual financial status of the citizens themselves is very important when contextualizing the government debt load. And this is just showing the consumer balance sheet. This was done by JP Morgan as of the third quarter of last year. And it's showing the total amount of assets as about 170, you know, a third of that's in their house, 40% of that's in financial assets like stocks and bonds, and then what their liabilities are. So this is a pretty good situation. It's important to note that this is not evenly spread out. Obviously, you know, the wealthier cohorts are going to have a larger percentage of this, but it's still a good place to be for US citizens. And another way to look at this, if you don't believe these numbers, is just the amount of checkable deposits and money market funds held by people. And it's gone up quite a bit, especially spiked during 2020, the pandemic, when there was a lot of stimulative efforts by the government, right? So people are sitting on a pretty good, at least at the aggregate level, amount of assets relative to their debt. One other aspect of debt that's interesting, I didn't really know much about when I went into this, is, you know, who holds all the debt, right? Who are we indebted to? And this kind of looks to break that down. So 22% of our debt, of that $34 trillion, is held within the government itself. One of the biggest parts of that 22% is the Social Security Trust Fund. Social Security owns, by and large, government debt, right? So it's kind of money that we owe to ourselves. The other 3/4 of it's debt held by the public. And so if we were just to look at that part of it, what's interesting is $6 trillion of that debt held by the public is actually held by the Federal Reserve. And then we have $1.5 trillion held by state and local governments. And then you start getting into mutual funds and pension funds, and then other countries, right? This is foreign holders, Japan, the UK, China, and then all the other countries own a good portion of our debt as well. But they don't own all of it, right? I think that's kind of important to realize is we're not completely indebted to like one country or a group of countries or anything like that. A quarter of that's owed to ourselves. Another, you know, 6 trillion out of 34 trillion is owed to the Federal Reserve, which actually pays back the interest it earns to the government. And I'll kind of show that later. Okay, how to fix it. This is the probably most confrontational part of the presentation, because this is a difficult problem to fix and it requires pretty much pain somewhere. Okay, so what I showed is a very complicated chart, but this is called a Sankey chart that I made. And we're going to start with the blue side. Okay, so the blue is income that the government receives. And you can see about 2 trillion. So kind of almost half of the income that the government receives is in income taxes. So in a month, you're going to pay your income taxes, or maybe 6 months after that. That is what's fueling much of the government spending. After that, we have Social Security and Medicare taxes primarily. So that's taxes that are paid partially by employees and then partially by employers. Then we have corporate taxes as a smaller chunk here. And then there's this other revenue section. And I'll come back to that in a second. Okay, so we have $4.4 trillion of revenue that the government made. This was in 2023, by the way. So now it has to start spending it. Well, there's two big buckets that the government groups all of its spending into, and it's mandatory spending and non-mandatory spending, or another term could be non-discretionary spending or discretionary spending. So what's non-discretionary? What's mandatory? Well, Social Security, right? The government has already made the promise to pay for Social Security a long time ago, right? And so this big chunk right here, this $2 trillion, that's income and Social Security. If we were to look through that, 1.34 of that Social Security. Income security is going to be things like food stamps and disability. And then this other 0.37 here is VA and pension income. Okay. These are things basically the government says, without changing the laws, basically, these are things that are undebatable. We're spending this next year. We don't need to go and ask for approval or anything like that. This is already baked in. The next big chunk is healthcare, right? A little over half of this, maybe 2/3 of this is Medicare, and then the rest of it's Medicaid. Okay. So you can already see Social Security and healthcare by themselves takes up, if I'm just sort of eyeballing it, like 80% of our federal revenues. Okay. Then we get into some other programs, education and other programs. That's basically the rest of what they call mandatory spending. There's a whole bunch of stuff that's in there. Then when we get to the non-mandatory spending, so this is the stuff that year to year Congress is changing, right? Defense is half of that. So defense is actually called non-mandatory spending, which I was a little bit surprised of. I thought that would have been in the mandatory or non-discretionary bucket, but it's not. It's something that they could change, and it's currently almost $1 trillion, 800 billion. And then there's the rest of it, which is this 0.63. And that's in a bunch of stuff. Annual appropriations for, let's see what that was. Homeland Security, education, that can include things like paying off student debt, by the way. Transportation, research, food safety, science and space program, disaster assistance, environmental protections, public housing, and federal law enforcement, right? So that all goes in this kind of non-discretionary basket. Then of course we got to pay our interest. That's paying the debt load of past debt, right? Has nothing to do with this year. So anytime we spend more than what we make, we get a deficit. And last year our deficit was $2 trillion, which is a pretty enormous amount relative to history. So that's kind of it. How do you fix government debt? You increase the blue side or you decrease the red side, right? And so we can kind of go into all of these different categories of spending and income and try to figure out which ones do we change to improve the overall picture. So one thing you can do is increase taxes, right? You increase the blue side. Obviously, this is not very popular. There's not a lot of presidents that get very excited about saying my goal, oops, let me go back, sorry. My goal is to increase taxes on everybody. But in terms of one lever you can pull to improve the government debt situation, something you can do, right? And this is, we have a progressive tax system, right? Which meaning that people who make more money get taxed more, right? And that's what that's showing here. The top 1% or so gets taxed 30%. Kind of in the middle. So this middle quintile is the 50th percent person. They get taxed about 14%. And then the lowest quintile gets taxed about 4%. And none of that's from income taxes. That's all from payroll taxes, Social Security and Medicare. So you could increase taxes on the bottom. So make it a more even flat tax rate. You could make it more progressive, meaning you tax the 1% or the top 10% or top 20% even more than they're already taxed. That's a difficult thing to do, right? 24% of all the taxes paid are paid by the top 1%. So the top 1% is certainly paying their fair share. I guess the question for policymakers would be, could they pay even more, if it improves the debt situation and makes the whole country more stable? And that's certainly a debate for them and for another day. But that's one lever that they often talk about pulling to help the debt. The other, of course, is decreased spending. So leave taxes alone and decrease spending. And so we can look at what are the major things. And you guys kind of saw it back on the Sankey chart. The big red blocks tended to be income security, primarily Social Security, and then healthcare, right? And you can see what those have done in the past. And this dotted line is 2023. So anything to the right of that is forecasted spending on those major programs. At the top dark blue line, that's major healthcare programs, right? That's Medicare and Medicaid. As people get older, we are going to need to spend more on healthcare, right? That's just kind of a fact. Obviously, as more of kind of the baby boomer cohort goes into their Social Security age, that's going to raise the amount of Social Security benefits being paid as well. And then if we have to keep paying with those things by issuing more debt, that interest level is going to increase to the point to where in 2053, so this is 30 years away, we might be spending more on interest than on Social Security, on all discretionary spending, including defense and other programs. So it's definitely something we want to fix, right? What I was kind of showing in back with the other charts with our assets and our overall debt load is things seem to be okay right now. But that certainly doesn't mean that things are going to be okay if we just stay the same forever. And I don't know when that point is, what debt to GDP level we need to get to cause issues. But it is going to continue to increase unless we do something. So we may find out at some point if we don't do anything to curtail it now. Okay, so let's dig into those levers a little bit. So first, the healthcare was the biggest, darkest line on that thing, right? How do we improve healthcare? I don't really know. Healthcare in 1960 cost 5% of GDP. Now it's almost 20% of GDP, right? So its importance in terms of how much the government spends on healthcare has grown by a ton, right? And some of that can be explained by an aging population, maybe, but also if we just look at the amount of spending per person, the US is spending an enormous amount relative to, let's say, the average, right? That's that blue line. They're spending twice as much on healthcare per person than the average of these major developed economies, right? So why is that? I'm not exactly sure. I'm sure it has something to do with, red tape and maybe us subsidizing other countries and maybe some pharmaceuticals or something like that. But I really don't know. It's a complicated topic that I haven't delved into. But if there is a way to improve this, that would obviously change the trend lines, right? That healthcare line might start to actually go down, and we would be able to kind of more balance the budget in the future. But that would require something to change, either our laws that make healthcare more affordable or technology, say Ozempic or something, I don't know. Just other life-changing drugs or medical procedures that could reduce the cost of healthcare over time. So that's something we definitely want. The other is Social Security. So look, the baby boomers was an enormous population, right? It was a very, very big generation in terms of just sheer amount of people. And the generations before that were smaller, and the generations after that were smaller, okay? And what that means is that as those baby boomers enter the Social Security age where they start drawing benefits, the amount of people, current workers who are paying those Social Security and Medicare taxes is decreasing, right? So you have less people supporting the program. This wasn't an issue when the program was made. So back when Social Security was sort of invented, there wasn't, let me just show you on the chart. There's four workers for every beneficiary. This is 1960, okay? So moving forward a little bit. 4 workers for every beneficiary. Well, that math works, right? If you're taxing 4 people to support 1 person, that's okay. But you can see how it's changed over time. 2023, that's this 4th line right here. We have 2.7 people supporting every beneficiary, and that's going to go down even more. So what could that mean? It could mean increasing Social Security taxes. It could mean decreasing benefits. It just means the math doesn't work as well. There's other issues that have happened. One, people's life expectancy has gone up 5 years. So before, when the government came up with the program, they thought maybe you'd live 12 years. Now that's looking more like 16, 17 years after you start taking benefits, okay? That's something they didn't account for. Okay, so staying on the topic of Social Security, the actual Social Security fund is being drained, as I'm sure a lot of you know. You've probably heard, Social Security is going to run out of money around 2030. This chart has it about 2034, and then we'll have to start issuing debt basically to continue to pay those Social Security benefits. So what are some potential reforms that people have come up with? Increase Social Security payroll taxes, right? So today it's about 12.4%, make it 15%. So that would increase the taxes on current employees and employers, right? But that would help support people who are currently taking benefits. You could increase the retirement age. This already happens a little bit. It used to be 65, now it's 67. At some point, maybe it's 70. When I take Social Security, who knows what it's going to be? Maybe it'll be 75, but that's something that could help extend the life of Social Security and make the plan work. And then there's more nuanced options to adjusting benefits. You could change the amount that retirees receive when they first apply. You could reduce the amount for people who earn higher wages or have a higher net worth, right? So income testing, wealth testing, things like that. You could also, this is an interesting one that I never heard, but you can just change the cost of living adjustment every year. So right now, Social Security goes up every single year. It's called COLA, the cost of living adjustment. And that goes up to keep up with current prices, right? If we have inflation, your benefit needs to go up in order to, maintain your purchasing power. It currently uses CPI. I guess some economists believe that one overstates inflation and there are better metrics to use. In fact, there's something called chained CPI, which is actually what tax rates are pinned to. So tax rates adjust with chained CPI, which tends to be about a quarter point. It grows a quarter point slower than CPI. All right, so this is a situation where revenue is growing slower than benefits are. And so they've thought maybe one way to change it is to make them the same. Either way, none of these are popular. Nobody wants to touch these. You have to upset somebody, right? You have to either upset people who are currently paying taxes or upset somebody who is receiving benefits. Neither one is popular, and so nothing's been done about it. And I'm sure there's been a lot of looking into ways around it or other means that we can do to improve the debt situation. This is certainly the biggest lever that one could pull. Finally, I put not the debt ceiling. So the debt ceiling is something that is used to bring a lot of attention to the debt. In fact, it's probably why I'm doing this presentation. It's because we had a debt ceiling debate last summer. And then we're in the midst of one right now. The thing is, the debt ceiling always goes up. And this black line is a line of the debt ceiling and how it's gone up many, 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 many times for the last, 50 years. If I went back even further, you would see that the same thing is happening, okay? So the debt ceiling always goes up. It's not a rule that's mandated. It's something that Congress imposed on itself. But the interesting thing is it wasn't imposed as a way to make us more fiscally responsible. The reason that it was issued was before 1917, so again, World War I, each loan that was issued by the Treasury required authorization from Congress. So basically, anytime we wanted to spend more money, Congress had to get back in session. They had to go talk about it, vote on it. And it was very inefficient, especially in a time where things are moving quickly, like a world war. So they created this debt ceiling to basically say, okay, all debt is approved, just keep it under this level, the debt ceiling. But it made things much more efficient to where Congress didn't have to convene and debate every single bill or every single piece of debt that they wanted to issue. It was more of an efficiency tool. But fast forward several years, its purpose has kind of changed. We really don't need it anymore. In fact, there's been tons of efforts to abolish the debt ceiling altogether, but it has remained as kind of a political way to bring attention to the debt and say, hey, if we keep raising this thing, we're just going to start spending like crazy and we're going to have a terrible debt crisis and default. And inflation or yada, yada, yada. But as you can see, Republican or Democrat, it doesn't matter. The debt ceiling continues to go up, and it has to, because much of the spending that we're doing is already agreed upon, right? We're not debating if we should pay Social Security next year or the year after that. It's predetermined money that we're going to spend. So that debt ceiling has to go up in order to address those, to pay those obligations. So the debt ceiling is really more of a tool to bring attention to and create debate, and possibly some good policy decisions, but it's not necessarily that's something that's necessary or that actually helps lower debt. So that's really it. The last thing I just wanted to show you is, obviously this is a complicated, deep, long topic. And you guys can actually go and attempt to fix it yourself. So the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget has actually created a debt fixer tool. And I found it very interesting. I went through it a couple of times. You can go to this website, which I included the URL for, and I can send this to any of you if you'd like after this presentation. You go in and it goes in, well, first off, it tells you the goal, right? It says fixing the national debt. It'll have a whole thing about who this committee is, what their goals are. So we're at 116%, or that's what they project will be at, 116% debt to GDP in 2034, 160 in 2050. They would like to see 97% of GDP. And so they say, well, how do we do that? What do we have to cut? What do we have to increase in taxes? And if you go through this exercise, you'll see, number one, it's extremely in depth. I thought it was going to be something kind of simple, like, increase tax rate 5%, decrease, Medicare spending 5%, and then boom, you fix it. But it's not, because that's not realistic. It actually goes through the actual rules and things that politicians have already sort of offered as potential solutions. And you can go through them, turn some on, turn some off, and see if you can fix the national debt yourself. So I found it an interesting tool. It's something, if you want to go through, you could go through the whole thing in probably 5 minutes if you just ran through it. And if you really went in there and read every single proposal, you could spend probably an hour. So that's the topic. At the end of this, I just put some of the resources that I use. There's that Committee for a Responsible Budget. The Treasury obviously has a ton of information on this topic. This Peter G. Peterson Foundation, I found a lot of these graphics on, and there's several more that I didn't include, but they're a great resource to kind of put all this stuff in perspective. Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, and then the Congressional Budget Office, which actually has the federal budget on there, and can go into that quite a bit. So that is all I got. I know that was a lot, and I actually finished faster than I thought I was going to. So I'm happy I was able to get through all that. I'll kind of leave it open for questions for a little bit. There is a chat box that you guys have. Feel free to ask a question if you want. Otherwise, I am available, whenever you guys need me. So feel free to call or email me if you want the presentation. If you want to go over a certain slide, or if you just have any other questions, I'm happy to talk about it. Okay, we got a couple of things. So if the government shuts down, how does that affect the debt? Okay, so when the government shuts down, there's a certain amount of time we have after the government shuts down to continue to pay our obligations, right? So you can kind of think of it like almost like money that you leave in your checking account, right? If you cut off your income, which is basically what happens when you shut down the government, you still have a little bit of money left. And so let's say the government shuts down tomorrow, we have, let's say, 3 to 6 months of runway where we have that remaining money that has not been spent yet, and we can spend it over the months. We can pay people's Social Security, we can keep the lights on at government, industrial businesses, or the power grid or whatever. But at some point, there literally will not be any money to fund those things. And so it could be pretty devastating, right? We will default on a debt payment. I have no idea how the world will take that, right? If there's this kind of idea, our debt was recently downgraded from AAA to AA. by one of the big bond ratings agencies. And it really had nothing to do with the fact that we can't pay our debts. It was more seeing some of the political turmoil. Will the government just sort of choose, not be able to agree on raising the debt ceiling and choose to default? And if that happens, how will the rest of the world take it? You're technically defaulting on your debt. That's about as bad of a thing you can do. But everyone kind of knows that it's self-inflicted. So where they'll sort of be like this forgiveness period, and it's like, hey, get yourself together, and then we'll just pretend it didn't happen. I have no idea. I don't think really anybody does, or maybe somebody does, but I don't think it's well known or talked about. But yeah, so there's a little bit of runway, but at some point, yeah, government officials are not going to get paid. And I don't mean like politicians and congressmen. Actually, an interesting fact is the Senate and the House, they do get paid even when the government's shut down. But if you are another government employee for a lower agency, you do not get paid. So you would just be on back pay until finally the government was reopened. But also, like, if you're a veteran and you're getting a pension, that would not get paid, right? So there's a bunch of things. Let me read this other question here real quick. The dollar loses the reserve currency status, the value of the dollar will plummet fast. How to protect the dollar besides buying farmland and getting out of debt? Okay, so I do agree. If the dollar were to lose the reserve currency status, well, I don't know if it would plummet fast, but it would certainly be dangerous. This is getting into the speculation territory, meaning I don't totally know what would happen if the dollar were to lose its reserve currency. I don't know, number one, who it would lose it to, right? So you would have to kind of see another growing power to sort of take its place. Maybe that's the euro. They're in second place right now. Maybe that's China. Maybe that's some other currency system that we don't know about or thinking about, gold or Bitcoin. I don't think so, but those are other options. I imagine that the dollar would go down in value. Some of that's going to depend too on just the economic growth that we're having, right? If US consumers are continuing to spend and they're healthy, people are still going to want our dollars, right? Because Americans are spending dollars to go buy stuff. And so the rest of the world will still want that, and that'll support the value of the dollar. But I imagine if we were to lose our reserve currency status, that means the economy has not been good and people aren't spending as many dollars. So yeah, that can be pretty damaging. There are other, sometimes I look at Japan, for example. Japan has an enormous amount of debt. Their stock market just broke even after 34 years. So they went down and never came above water again until 34 years. This happened about a month ago. They had negative interest rates. Their population is decreasing. So they have a lot of issues. But despite that, I mean, Japan's a pretty nice place to live, right? They have a pretty good standard of living, high income per capita. So it's hard for me to know if we could have a situation like that, where maybe we're not the premier dominant force in the world. But other than that, things are okay. I really have no idea. I'm just going to start speculating at that point. But then how do you protect the dollar? So like, how do you protect your money in a situation like that, where that's happening? So you certainly could buy farmland or just real estate in general, things that will hold their value, hopefully, even if the dollar is losing its value. I suppose you could buy gold or even like a Bitcoin, which is kind of the new gold. That is, serious speculation on my part. I don't know. In the past, gold has been something that's held its value. Will it continue to do so in the future? I couldn't really speculate on that, but it certainly has in the past. You could buy inflation protected stuff. So there are like government bonds that are issued that do adjust with inflation. So even if inflation went up 100% in a year, the value of that bond would go up 100%, right? And so that would protect your dollar in something like that. Stocks have inflation protection, because you can imagine if the price of, let's say, oil goes up 100%, well, airlines are going to raise their prices 100%. So as long as people are still using their services at the same rate, they will protect some of those margins, right? And so stocks aren't quite as sensitive to high inflation as, say, a bond. Bonds would be devastated in high inflation. So I guess long story short, if we ever did see that high inflation scenario, got to get out of bonds and definitely get out of your currency, put it in something, either spend it or buy hard assets and maybe stocks. Hopefully that was sufficient on that one. Give it about another 30 seconds and then we can call it. Okay, guys, I think that'll do it. Again, thank you guys for joining me today. I enjoy talking about this stuff. I know it was a lot of in-depth information, but I find it interesting. So hopefully you guys do too. I'm going to be doing another one of these in about 2 months. That'll be more on like how to invest your cash and other aspects of your portfolio. And if you guys have any additional questions or just want to talk about this anymore, feel free to call or email me. I'm around whenever you guys need me. Thank you.